Hey everybody, it's Ruby here today, and I thought that I would do a book review for Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore by Robert Sloan. This was a book that was recommended to me by a friend of mine who had to study it in a university English class, and he described it as a book that relates to our generation. That is, someone who grew up with computers but also really likes books. And so I thought that I would give this a try because, considering that this is my generation, I wanted to see what the author's take of it was, either if they are my age or if they're older and that sort of thing. This is about a person around my age, 20 years old, who just leaves art school and is laid off from a job that he has designing logos and websites for this bagel company. So he basically has to go door to door during the recession and try and find a job somewhere in San Francisco. And he comes across this bookstore, Mr. Penumbra's bookstore, that is open 24 hours, and he gets the late shift in that bookstore. But instead of customers coming in and buying the contemporary books at the front of the bookstore, he is confronted with people who loan out books in the back of the bookstore, which is sort of all archaic leather-bound books. And he's told by the bookstore owner not to look through these books and not to ask questions. And of course he does. And he discovers secret societies, and he gets caught up in this whole big thing, which I won't talk about because I'd rather you looked for it for yourself, and of course I can answer any questions later on. This book is really hard to review because I have very mixed feelings about it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the pros and the cons of this book. So the pros of this book is that I do think that this was a fairly good, accurate depiction of my generation. It was more about trying to find your way in a less than ideal economy. It was about getting into art school and finding out basically that you don't have a job coming out. There's people in this who start up their own companies, who are entrepreneurs, like a lot of people I know who are, and it does deal with a lot of computers. It's about how our generation kind of solves a lot of things through computers, which I think is sort of an accurate thing. Like, I fought it for a little while, but I mean, the first thing you're going to do is Google something if you don't understand it or if you want more information about it. And there was an interesting dynamic that I did really like, which is that the bookstore itself is fairly archaic. It's basically described as a bookstore that should be is vertical rather than horizontal. So all the bookcases are really high and you have to get a ladder to try and go up to the top, and it's very thin bookstore. And everything about it, the entire atmosphere, appeals to the main character, and it also appeals to the reader. Because although we do really like computers and we do rely on computers, there are a lot of people who do still like physical copies of books and where the books are kept, right? So that was all really cool. And the secret societies and the things that happen later on and the people that you meet sort of remind me of characters that you would read in books, like fantasy books, not these sorts of books, and books that you just generally sort of think about. So I thought that was really cool and interesting, and for that particular sake, I would definitely recommend people read this. The cons, however, are nearly the flip side of the pros, and the cons are that the author was creating a too stylized version of it. Like, he was trying to write a version where he was telling people of his generation what my generation is like, even though he isn't even in my generation. He's, I think, around 40. And so the narration seems very young. It's very much like having likes and ands and very sort of contemporary descriptions, and a lot of more like, it had a very general fiction or even like young adult fiction sort of feel, which I felt like maybe didn't necessarily need to be in a book like this. You could have done a lot of different things, but he chose to stylize the narration quite a bit. And I do find some of the characters sort of irritating. There's a character who does boob technology, which I found to be something that was supposed to be funny, but I found just kind of odd. Like, why would you include that? And like someone else who works for Google, and it seems like all they were doing was sort of singing praise to Google. And I do understand that a lot of people love Google. Like, people are making YouTube accounts and they're doing Google+, and every time a YouTuber goes to Google, they film it. Like, that is all understandable. I understand why people like Google, but I kind of felt like he was playing up the Google part as well. And considering that there's a character who works at Google, I almost felt like that character was trying to be like an archetypical portrayal of Google, which sort of irritated me. Both these pros and cons, I think, have to do with what I consider to be books and what I consider to be my generation. I was, I guess, a little bit disappointed that it didn't focus mainly on the physical aspects of books, and that wasn't sort of more singing praise to books or talking about how my generation does still like books, rather than kind of trying to integrate them both seamlessly and being kind of unable to. But that's my view on it. I did discuss it with two other people who read it. The first person who recommended it to me and the second person who I told them to read, and both of them seemed fine with it. The second person did say that some of the characters were a little flat, and they were sort of vehicles for the plot, and things like that, but there was other things that I think people liked quite a bit, like they talk about type fonts and sort of where you keep the archives for museums and stuff like that, which were things that I think the author kind of put a twist on and made you sort of think, like, is that a fictional thing? Is that a real thing? Like, how much of this is fictional and how much of it is real? Which I think is something that an author should do. I think an author should keep you guessing. And this is definitely a book like that. I think overall I gave this a 3 out of 5 because I'm very iffy on it. I think it's a book that I was glad to have read. It was a very contemporary book and it was overall great, but it was sort of disappointing when I had just read things like War and Peace and stuff, where even the language was poetic when he was sort of talking about his thesis statements. So I think that you should take that sort of review into account and take it with a grain of salt, that I think a lot of people would, especially in the booktube community, like this book quite a bit, but that it wasn't necessarily my taste. That is everything. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and let me know down below if there are other books that you think would be like that, or even just what you think of people who try to stylize characters in terms of their generations or in terms of their sort of context around them. Like always, comment, subscribe, like, do your thing if you liked this video, and I will talk to you guys later.